Got that immediately. Nope.
Welcome to Metamorphic Side Productions ASMR podcast. We're completely changing everything about the podcast. We are now going to be an ASMR channel only.
If you do this, I will leave.
We're going to whisper the entire time.
If you do, that's fine. I'm not.
We're back. I'm going to change the record levels.
I'm going to change the record levels.
Let's try that.
I like that.
Okay. We're back, everyone. We are back in the studio. We're recording a new episode of Two Christians Watch. I'm Hannah. That's Will. We're part of Metamorphic Side Productions. This is our podcast called Two Christians Watch, where we're two Christians and we watch movies and then we talk about it. How are you doing today? I hope you're having a good day. I hope you're listening to this podcast, this episode, while you're driving, you're cooking, you're folding your laundry, having a wonderful day. About to bring you a wonderful new episode.
Yep. Rad.
Okay, so this episode is part of our series for movies we believe every Christian should watch. This is our second film in that series. Today is going to be about the Book of Eli from 2010. But actually, before we get into that, I did a little bit more research about our past film, Sergeant York, which we watched last month and talked about. And I have a little bit more research about that. And I guess I'll just run through it. I didn't have you look at this, so you don't know what it is. It's going to be all me.
I'm just going to let you go for a little bit.
Okay, so I did some research more because I just felt like I was lacking last episode. I did make a little, not warning, but in front of the video and in the show notes on the last episode, we encouraged people to watch older films, which I still stand by. It's great. But I was also saying that there are some older films that have problematic elements in them. Sergeant York is not one of those films, but there are films that are of a certain age that have elements of racism in them or sexism. And even when you watch those films and you find them on streaming, they usually have a trigger warning in the beginning. And yeah, like I said, you don't have to watch or appreciate those films at all, but there are tons of older films from that period that are wonderful and are great to watch. You know, there's the Philadelphia Story, Citizen Kane, wonderful films that are enjoyable and only enhance your appreciation of film and learn about film history. But if any film has any problematic elements to it, do not feel entitled to watch it or enjoy it. I don't believe Sergeant York had anything in there that was offensive. Some people might take offense to how American propagandic it is, like for war. I'm gonna actually it's in my blurb about information I looked up about this movie is about it being considered propaganda. But yeah, I just wanted to say that because I put that in the last episode, but I thought about that as I was editing it. I was like, oh, we didn't put that disclaimer about older films, so just be wary about when you go to watch an older film. I would suggest going on like the Parents Guide on IMDb. Usually for every film, I think every film I've ever looked up the Parents Guide, there is one on IMDb for it. Or you can just do a quick search of like trigger warning, the film title. You know, like is there something there? So that would be my suggestion for watching older cinema that might have those elements in them. Here's the information that I looked up that's a little bit more about Alvin York and the movie Sergeant York and the making of the movie. So in the movie, Sergeant York, he is converted during this, he gets struck by lightning and he doesn't die. He is holding an umbrella, or no, he's holding his gun, right? And it causes the lightning to redirect and him and his horse, donkey, whatever he had with him, they don't die. And it's like right at that moment, he hears this like singing and there's the congregation, the body of believers is together and they're singing a hymn and he comes in and he like realizes that God saved him and he's like this divine intervention. That was made up for the movie. He did convert to Christianity, but he did not get struck by lightning. So he converted during a revival, which are very common back then. And this, they still happen now, but maybe you can speak to this. The revivals in America at that time, so this is right before World War I, revivals were a way that the church basically wanted to reach or do outreach to their community. And literally it's in the name revive. They wanted to revive the fervor for God in their community and also be a way for people to be converted. They still have revivals today. Revivals are mostly, I feel like, a Southern thing. I don't know if they say that in other parts of the US. I feel like if you they're having a revival, that's like very like Southern Baptist language, but I guess it would be maybe evangelical. There also revivals. I know this is getting off topic. Revivals have people are kind of calling to that era of American Christianity as being way too focused on emotion. But I think that's neither here nor there. There are plenty of people who go to revivals who get saved or have their faith renewed or whatnot. Do you have any comments on that through an American history lens?
Yeah, so turn of the century, even up to like the 30s, 40s, 50s, revivals were very common. It was to bolster church attendance. It was to bring in new people to the church, people who had left the church. One that would be in the mountains of Tennessee is going to be significantly smaller than one in a big city. A lot of it is very emotion driven, very guilt and conviction driven, and it's very loud and boisterous, and it's meant to like convey urgency. Can't speak to exactly what this one revival was that Sergeant York was at, but traditionally, especially turn of the century revivals, it was very, as Christians call it, fire and brimstone preaching with a sense of urgency, life or death mentality.
Yeah, I think there are ups and downs to revivals. They've been criticized for being too much based on emotion, and sometimes they will cause people to convert, but not really to convert. But I will say that they do have a place. Like, obviously, this affected Alvin York, and God used it in a mighty way in his life, because this led him to where he eventually landed in his life. I wouldn't say that they're completely wrong, but that's where he actually got saved at a revival. It was not like struck of lightning. He might have felt like he got struck by lightning. Maybe that's how they got to that emotional, dramatic, cinematic moment. But that's not true in the story. And then the next thing I found out, so beginning soon after Alvin York returned from World War I, it was debated at the accuracy of the story told and if the other soldiers with him should have been given more recognition. I think he was the only one in that platoon or whatever it was called, that group, to receive any accolades. There's a book that someone wrote about the other soldiers that were present. I think we talked about that. Yeah, they should be acknowledged for sure. But it was, as much as research as I found, there was a lot of recognition given amongst the soldiers, both American and German, to Alvin York in that situation. But yes, I believe that the other soldiers should have been given more recognition. And it's just, that was just the way America was back then, where they just sensationalized certain things, especially with the media and things like that.
Especially during that time, everybody was looking for like the next American hero. That's when you started getting, not just then, but a little later, spaghetti westerns. You started getting the novelization of like Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone, and creating these mighty figures of historical value for sensational purposes, for attracting audiences, but also, for lack of a better word, America was lacking its pantheon of iconic characters. Other than our founding fathers and a few presidents, we needed a series of heroes to look up to that would be iconic.
Yeah. A big part of studying American cinema is the creation of the American cultural myth. So you mentioned Westerns. The cowboy was a big one, and World War I and World War II heroes. And so Alvin York is right in the middle of that. He's someone that America looked to kind of form a national identity around. That doesn't mean that the other soldiers should be ignored. They should be given recognition. I'm glad someone wrote that book about them. Hopefully I can find the title of it again and put it in the show notes if anyone's interested. FDR quoted York on the regular in his speeches. So this also probably led to York becoming more of this like mythical American hero, because literally this very important president is always referencing him in his speeches and his not announcements, but like his addresses to the Union. So yeah, that probably added to York being kind of wrapped up into the American myth, because even before his film, FDR was quoting him in his speeches and quoting him just as a reference when he was making his own speeches to the nation. Okay, so I found out about Jesse L. Lasky. He was a producer. So producer Jesse L. Lasky was the one who hounded York to make his story. He's the one who wanted to make his story into a movie, even in the very beginning, but way before the movie actually was made. I couldn't find anything about him purposely wanting it to be a World War II propaganda film. He wanted to make the movie like right away. I don't know back then. Now films have to purchase rights to stories. They have to purchase film rights. So if someone writes a book, or if someone, I guess, has a personal experience, a company has to contact the person who had the experience, or the author of the book, whoever owns the rights to that. They have to buy the film rights from them. I don't know if that's how this worked back then. Obviously, York could stop the production of the movie because it didn't happen before it did. Like Lasky or Lasky just didn't like go out and make the movie. But he wanted to make it well before World War II, probably well before they knew there was going to be a World War II. So it's debatable if it was ever intentioned to be propaganda. The timing of it definitely led it to be propaganda, but I don't know if there was intention there, because he wanted to make the movie like right when he came home. He wanted to start making the movie. So I wrote that, is the timing suspicious? But I don't know. Maybe. I don't know. We know that York said he wanted to finally do the movie to acquire some funds for his college. So maybe it was just coincidence. Or maybe they offered more money because of the timing. They were like, this would be a great movie to have right now. And so they offered him more money, and that was like, oh, I need that for my college. So all those things could have ended up in the timing of the film being released. So Alvin York was present during filming for a couple of days. He ended up crying after an insensitive crew member asked him about his kill count. He ended up having a breakdown on set because a crew member asked him how many like heads he got or something in a very insensitive way, which, you know, World War I and World War II was the beginning of us understanding PTSD. But man, that broke my heart when I learned that. I was like, oh man, but here's another thing. They almost fired that crew member because of how he affected York. And York said, no, I don't want that man to lose his job. I forgive him. It also speaks, you know, crazy amounts about his character and how crisis influenced him. And then the thing about propaganda, again, when the film came out, there were isolationists who accused the film of being solely propaganda. And York defended that, and he said no. He kind of went back and forth about isolationists. Like, he kind of began as an isolationist, and then as it got worse, he was like, no, we have to step in, which we see in the movie where he believed that when it got to the point where they could do something to stop it, then they should. So York himself went back and forth about being an isolationist, but there were people at the time who were like, this movie is just propaganda. So it's been around the conversation about the film ever since the beginning. But there are people even from the beginning who are like, oh no, it's not solely propaganda, or it's not propaganda at all. So and then Gary Cooper did win the Academy Award for his portrayal of York. So I don't know if that was his first win, but he won an Oscar for his performance in Sergeant York. Those are all the things I found that I wanted to kind of go over since we had a light episode last time, and that's all that I have. I just wanted to add a little bit more because I felt like this movie deserved a little bit more research. I decided, you know what, I'm going to make up for that in the next episode, and that's my end for the little blurbs, little info dump about Sergeant York, and we will officially move on to the Book of Eli. Book of Eli, much more recent film, and before we get into any of the how it was made or anything about the writer or the directors, we will throw it over to Will to give us a summary of the film. Be forewarned, this film's a little violent.
Yeah, I would like to set that as a warning. While we say that that Christians should watch this is a secular film, and as such, they are not privy to our morals as much as we would like. There are some extremely violent scenes. I'm not saying violence is necessarily Christian or non-Christian, but it gets very gory and very bloody. And then there's also some insinuated sexual references. They don't show anything, but it's implied something happens in different moments of the movie, or would happen if something didn't intervene. There's also strong language in this. However, we watched it anyways, and we still would suggest it, and we'll get to that in a little bit.
I don't think there's any nudity.
No nudity.
There is some violence, or some graphic violence. There's violence, but a lot of it isn't that graphic, like blood and, gratuitous. And then I think some strong language.
Right.
Okay.
So just try to give a short summary. It's hard to kind of set the stage because the stage starts with a character named Eli hunting, trying to gather food. And then it shows basically that he is in a wasteland, that he is traveling on this road. It is dry. It is barren. There's decrepit cars. There's decrepit buildings. And as it's slowly evolving, it's making it clear that there are also hostile people. And so he's not alone, but he's threatened by people who are wanting to take his belongings, take his life. And he's able to defend himself, and he's able to protect himself pretty readily. As the story unravels, you start realizing that 30 years earlier in the story, some cataclysmic event happens in humanity that was either resulted in a war or caused a war that led to pretty much society ending, but prefaced by everybody burning their Bibles and trying to eliminate Bibles from existence. something else happens. It's not really explained, but that something happens with the ozone layer to where the sun, I believe it was the sun, was so strong and so bright that it blinded people. It's either hinted it's the sun or it's some kind of nuclear blast. Both are extremely bright enough that could blind somebody.
I think what happened, it was a nuclear war, because people have like warts and disfigurations, like it's been from like radiation poisoning, and that the nuclear war caused destruction of the ozone, and so people went blind because the light, basically UV radiation was too bright, it was destroying their eyes. Also, maybe leftover radiation poisoning also caused things like blindness.
So not everyone is blind, but you could see where certain people weren't not necessarily connected to the explosions. They either came after it and they were born and grew up after the war, or they were hidden away from the war. And so society is desperately trying to rebuild itself, scavenging, trying to gather resources, and slowly society is losing the true story of what happened, but also what society was like before the end of everything and the rebuilding of everything. So we catch up with this guy named Eli. He's a scavenger, and it seems like he is trying to be somewhat of a moral compass, trying to keep everything on the straight and the narrow, but he wants to be by himself. He's on a mission. He's got a purpose. He ends up in this town where it's basically this town is trying to hold on to any fabric of civilization that's left. They have a small store. They have a bar. They have leadership, but the leadership is corrupt. They are using women as objects and as tools in bargaining, and they are hoarding resources, mainly books, for knowledge and for information, and they also are in control of the area's water supply. So Eli gets to the city. He is trying to get some resources. He crosses the wrong people. When he crosses the wrong people, the leadership of the town takes him in. They're like, hey, we see that you're skilled. You're able to defend yourself. We would love to have you as part of the team. And he said, no, but I would be happy to stay the night and then be on my way. And they're trying to convince him to stay. And he's introduced to this girl, Mila Kunis' character. I do not remember her name, and that's a failing on my part. I don't remember her character's name.
It's like an interesting name. It's like
Solara?
Solara? I think it's Solara.
Maybe it's Solara. She's basically sent by the leader. So the leader, his name is Carnegie. And Carnegie is played by
Gary Oldman.
Gary Oldman. Look at me. Brain farts here. Gary Oldman is the leader. He is obviously corrupt and he's power hungry, but he's also trying to... He was a survivor from the war, and he remembers what civilization was like. Solara,
yes,
and her mom, Claudia, work for him as basically servants.
Claudia is played by Jennifer Beals.
He sends in Solara to Eli to stay with him during the night. He resists any advances she makes because it's obvious that she is being forced to make these advances towards him by Carnegie to try to win him over and stay at the city.
I think also because he is a believer.
Well, we haven't gotten there yet.
Oh, okay, sorry.
And so she's trying to figure out why is he resisting? Why is he leaving? Why won't he just cooperate? Because she knows that Carnegie's going to make her life trouble if he doesn't stay. And what he does is he offers her some of his food and then he prays with her. And she doesn't know what prayer is. She's never been introduced to prayer. And then he spends time talking with her throughout the night. When she leaves in the morning, she is so moved by Eli's lifestyle that when she sees her mother having breakfast, she prays with her mother for the first time. She doesn't know what she's doing, but she's praying and trying to mimic what Eli did. Carnegie sees this and remembers, firstly, what Christians were, and the fact that the Christians haven't been around in a while, but also he's looking for books. If you remember what I said earlier, he's looking for books as a source of information, as a source of power. It's revealed then that the core book he's looking for is the Bible. And he is now believing that Eli must either know where a Bible is or can have access to a Bible. And so he finds out through Solara that Eli had a book. And he is able to put two and two together that Eli has a Bible. And this is true. Eli has the last known Bible in existence. And so Eli is able to escape after injuring Carnegie and his men, and Solara ends up following him against his will at first, but then he learns to protect her because he's like, I'm on a mission, and he reveals that his mission is to get to the Bible west to a place that is safe. And so as he's starting to evolve the mission, evolve the story and talking about it, he says that God spoke to him after the war and told him that he will protect him as long as he takes the Bible from where he was on the East Coast all the way to the West Coast to a place where the Bible would be safe. And that journey has taken 30 years. And over those 30 years, every day he spent time reading and memorizing the scriptures. And so he can recite it by heart, and he prays out loud with Solara, teaching her about the Bible. Meanwhile, Carnegie and his men are hunting them down because they want the Bible. Carnegie reveals that the Bible has always been a source of power. It's a source of faith. He's like, in the right hands, the Bible can be used to sway the masses. The Bible can be used to manipulate the masses and get somebody in a position of power to make people do whatever he wants. And so he's like, if I can have the Bible, convince people of its power, then I've won. Then I can do whatever I want because I can tell everybody what it says, even if it doesn't say that. And so he's going to go hunt down Eli. Eli runs into several instances of more raiders trying to kill him and Solara.
Do you want to mention one of the guys that plays in the Raiders?
Yeah, one of the raiders is Ray Stevenson. He played Punisher in a Punisher movie, but he also played Balin Skull in the Ahsoka series. Much beloved by me and one of my pastors. Great actor. Sadly, he left us last year, but he does an excellent job in this movie as a conflicted raider who does not want to harm people, but he is also willing to survive at whatever cost. Basically, Carnegie and his men are able to pin Eli to an area and surround him, and they end up capturing Solara and gravely injuring Eli. And so what happens is Eli's like, God promised me he's going to get me there, and I'm going to get there. And so Eli loses the book to Carnegie. Carnegie takes the book and drives off, and Eli's like, I still got to keep going. I got to go. I told God I was going to make it there, and I'm going to make it there. And Carnegie gets back to his base, opens it up, and it's revealed that the Bible is in Braille, and that Eli was one of the blind people that survived the blasts. And so Eli spent 30 years memorizing the Bible so that when he gets to the West Coast, he finds out that the safe house is on Alcatraz Island, and a surprise cameo by Malcolm McDowell is the archivist of this island. He's basically trying to rebuild civilization, democratic and healthy means.
He wants to collect as many old pieces of culture, religion, just history, and it's kind of like in the Dark Ages when they found all the old Roman, the monks were there just like copying what they could and like making sure they could preserve history as well as they could. So kind of what he's doing.
Right. And so Eli's like, I've got a Bible, but it's not conventional. He said, I'm going to need you to write all this down. So he recounts the Bible word for word to Malcolm McDowell as Malcolm McDowell writes it down, and then they officially reprint the Bible in English and begin binding it. And so Eli's wounds catch up to him, and Eli passes away, leaving Solara with the task of carrying on and trying to learn how to live in this world without a leader and without guidance, and trying to figure out how to survive with the knowledge that Eli has passed down to her. And it kind of cuts there, leaving you kind of wondering what's next, kind of leaving you with this kind of self-contained story of like a potential future or what if future that is meant to make you think and ponder.
You say enclosed story, but there's a sequel. No, not a sequel, a prequel series in the works right now with the writer, and John Boyega's name's attached to it, where it's like it would be basically how Eli became Eli, how he found the book and everything.
I'm nothing against John Boyega, great actor. It's more that I don't feel like it's needed. I think a bit of the mystery of what exactly happened in those 30 years that we don't see, I think it adds to the allure of the film, but it also firmly highlights what we do see.
Yeah.
And it lets us just kind of engross ourselves in what we do see, because we don't know what happened in the past. We just are like, he's here, he's a skilled warrior, but he's also very quiet, very stoic, and he is carrying on this mission that he said, God told me to do this. God would protect me even if I get injured, that I'm going to be the one to carry the Bible there. And that's it. And so adding a prequel, I think it just fluffs it up too much.
I don't know if we mentioned it. I think it goes without saying, but Denzel Washington plays Eli.
Not mention that, but
And he does an excellent job. I think I have enjoyed him the most. He is an excellent actor in everything he's in, but like he just really shined in this movie. And then I'm looking on the cast list. It says Michael Gambon, who was the Dumbledore that took over in the Harry Potter series, was in this movie. Played George, but I'm not sure exactly who George was. I don't remember him being in there. Maybe the barkeep. Maybe the guy that... Isn't Tom Waits like a famous person too? He says he was the engineer, which I'm assuming is the guy that he came to and it was like...
Yeah, with the iPod.
Yeah, I don't know who George was, but it says he was in this movie.
Wait, was George the farmer at the house?
Oh, we didn't. You skipped over that.
I skipped
completely.
that. Okay, so I skipped over a part where they found. I said that they found him at a house with Solara. I skipped over it because it is kind of gruesome. So there's an underlying story, a very like C story, where you kind of find out how far humanity has fallen into desperation. The city is interesting because there are a lot of remnants of normal civilization. There are stores, there are stuff that obviously covered in dust and dirt and grime, but there's some remnants of like civilization. Anything outside of that, the way that you find out that things are going crazy, first off, people killing each other, people, kidnapping, all these things, but also if somebody's hands are shaking, it's because they've eaten human beings too many times, and that their body is starting to
take on the effects of that, because there is like a disease you get from eating other humans.
And so they end up at a house with these two older people, and they have sandwiches and drinks and
with like weird gray meat in the sandwiches, and they're like,
you look over and you see that their hands are shaking.
Yeah,
and Eli tells the Solara, don't eat that. And he explains later, they were definitely cannibals. They
end up dying in the raid.
But they died defending Eli and Solara. Mm-hmm. So
I don't know. They still were cannibals. So that's very reminiscent of The Road, which is a very dark film. Matthew McCormick wrote the book, and then
Viggo
Mortensen is in it. But it's about a world where the land has turned so sour that basically animals couldn't survive. There's no vegetation, and so people have turned to cannibalism to survive mostly. I've never seen this movie. I need to watch it. I heard it's very sad, but it's about this Viggo Mortensen plays a father who's trying to get his son to the coast because winter's about to happen. That's neither here nor there. It's just it's a common theme where it's like it's so desolate that people have turned to those means, and they asked Eli to show his hands a lot because they're looking to see if he's shaky. So if you're a cannibal, they don't want you in the town. Mm-hmm. If they see that your hands are shaking or something, they're like, we won't serve you here. So it's interesting aspect to add to that whole story. So now that we did the summary, I have a little bit of information, little things I looked up about the making of the film and who made it. And I actually have some quotes from the writer and the directors I can read. So let's see. It says, The Book of Eli is a 2010 American post-apocalyptic neo-Western action film directed by the Hughes brothers, written by Gary Whitta and starring Denzel Washington, Gary Oldman, Mila Kunis, Ray Stevenson, and Jennifer Beals. Whitta was the screenwriter of The Book of Eli. He co-wrote After Earth with M. Night Shyamalan, and he co-developed the story for Rogue One. It's an interesting fact about the writer. Whitta is quoted as saying, "It's funny, a lot of people who see the movie assume that I'm a Christian. I'm not at all. I'm an atheist. But I'm fascinated by the way that religion and spirituality and faith does motivate people. It's clearly one of the great social forces in the world and has been for thousands of years. I thought I saw kind of an opportunity to try through the very popcorny nature of the movie. It's basically a good old-fashioned action-adventure post-apocalyptic thriller, but I wanted underneath all of that for it to be really about something. And I was really attracted to this idea of having this conversation about whether or not religion is a positive or negative force. The idea that I arrived at is that I think it's essentially down to whose ever hands it's in." And then I have one of the directors has a quote here about the film too. This is Albert Hughes, which is one of the brothers who directed it. "I didn't get it right away. My brother did. And I said, I don't know about the religious stuff or the spiritual stuff. And then I went to sleep and woke up after a few hours of dreaming about it and thought, okay, I get it. Creatively, I get it. Visually, I get it. Story-wise, I get it. It hit all cylinders. For some unexplained reason, in a way, I think the first draft was great. It just needed to be nuanced, that's all. Because it's dealing with anything sacred. If you talk about anything sacred, you have to handle it right. You can't just go in in there and make a movie and be careless about it because you are stepping on people's beliefs. You can't go into something like that being silly about it, no matter what you believe. So there is some direct quotes about specifically it being about faith and religious matters, and the people who made the film are not Christians, but they understand that it is something that people do believe in. And it seems that they both wanted to treat it with respect. I was wondering your opinion. Do you think that that comes through in how they made the film, that even though they're not believers, they wanted it to not be offensive to those who do believe?
Yeah, so I don't think it goes far enough to be like the Bible is the word of God, and it's going into the Christianese of inerrancy and infallibility and like literally God breathed. It doesn't go that far, but it doesn't just toss it into, it's just another book. It does give itself its own little bubble of saying this book is significant because it has played a role in society for hundreds of years, and it is a very powerful book with influences for groups of people all over the world. So much so that if the world ended, it would still hold its value to be brought back into civilization. If the world ended, a random map from 400 years ago is not going to hold the same value as the way they hold the Bible, where it's like, this has information and rules and concepts that could be used to help rebuild civilization. And so that holds it in that regard. At the same time, it doesn't elevate it too far, where at the end of the movie, Malcolm McDowell puts it on a shelf right next to the Quran and the Torah, and saying it's on equal footing in the sense that it's a religious book that is sacred, should be respected, and it's part of the top 3 religions in the world. And I think that's where it gets interesting, because it doesn't go too far, but it also doesn't make fun of the Bible. It holds it in just enough place that it doesn't feel silly that it's at the center of this movie, but at the same time, it feels a little weird at first because it's usually talked about in a different circle than an action movie. So it's bringing a sense of gravitas to this action movie that comes with just bringing up the Bible. But it's not, like they said, it's not silly, but it's also not ham-fisted. It's not like, here's the Bible, and it shapes the movie, but without overly dignifying it, but also not degrading it.
I thought it was interesting about the director saying that if you talk about anything sacred, you have to handle it right. And I think that we talked about that in regards to Darren Aronofsky with Noah, that he took something that was sacred and he took a lot of liberty with it, and we were like, that's kind of offensive. Maybe he should have thought more correctly about that, be more cautious. And I feel like they were very cautious when it came to the word of God. They didn't have him quoted a lot. They really wanted it to be about the importance of the word of God as a whole, and not so much about diving in. Like Noah is about a specific story. And I think that was a way they maybe protected themselves from getting something wrong. I think they did a lot of things right, though. I don't know if they intended for this, and maybe this can lead into us like talking about like why we think it is a good film to watch. One of the things that I really liked is that they talk about Eli, how he got these visions from God. Like it says that God led him to where the Bible was in the rubble, specifically one he could read. And then Eli talks about that he had this voice in his head saying, just go west, go west, go west. And we even see him make decisions based upon like what God directly tells him to do. And those decisions require a lot of faith. Specifically, I'm thinking about where Solara is almost taken or hurt or whatnot. And so he gives the book up in order to keep her safe, because God seems to tell him to do that in the moment. Like he obeys. And he says at one point, he's like, I got so wrapped up in protecting the word that I like forgot to live by it, to live by what the book said. And it was the way that they portrayed that. I was like, wow. And yeah, we're not saying that God will directly speak into your mind. That's another thing, is like in certain dire situations, like when the Bible was being written, prophets existed, and they did get direct messages from God, and they did get, like Moses had direct contact with God. But there are times where people have no other means of communicating with God, and he uses things like visions or dreams or whatnot to communicate to people. And so they weirdly got that correct, where it's this very extreme situation where there is no other Bibles left, and God picks someone to preserve his word in this situation. And I thought that was they got that weirdly right. I don't know if they did any research into that. If they thought like, were specifically like, well, if no one had access to the Bible, like how would God talk to somebody? You know, how would he get his word out there? Or how like, and then the other part of this is that how God will preserve his word and his will through anything that man does, that God is still sovereign. God's sovereignty is like huge in this story. It's never directly talked about, but it's shown very clearly. Do you have any thoughts on that? Or also like, what did you really like about the movie?
I mean, I told you about this when we were going into it. For a movie that is extremely secular, Hollywood blockbuster, you know, Hollywood big names associated with it, it handles the Bible in a lot of ways better than a lot of Christian movies. There are a lot of Christian movies, and I don't want to name names, not because of lack of resources, but because of trying to be respectful. There are a lot of Christian movies that hold the Bible in a position of magic, in the sense that if you read it, it'll make your dreams come true, or it's got the keys to your, you know, making your marriage magically better, or, you know, you find the answer that makes your hospital stay better, or whatever. They hold in this position of wonder and amazement, but not in the good way, in a way of almost like self-help / quick fix. Like, if you spend 5 minutes, you know, God's going to just like, boom, you're good. The way that it's held in this movie is, first off, he went for 30 years studying this, reading it, memorizing it, 30 years trying to get west on his own, on foot, through whatever chaos he had to face. Still didn't get west for 30 years. And yet he knew that this was the right thing to do. And he even when he had wrestling with doubts, he knew this is the path he needed to be on. And even when hardships came, it didn't break down the value of the word. And so the word still had importance and value and a long-term purpose, that even if at present it didn't seem visible or soon to be anticipated, that God was going to keep his word. And because God had kept his word throughout Eli's journey, God could keep his word at the end of the journey. And that is one way that it's different, that stood out. The second way is the way that Eli handles the word. He's protective of it. He is guarding it, but he also diligently takes time with it, but not in a obsessive way, because he balances his free time with also listening to music and resting and being at peace and just taking all his journey in. He is not cultish with it. He just holds it in esteem and value, and he spends his time in prayer and meditation on it, to the point where he's able to recite it to Solara. He's able to remind himself of it, and that is something that's just powerful. Again, reminiscent of Sergeant York, of practical application of being a Christian in a non-Christian world. What are your value systems? What are the things that you deem important? And how do those things affect how you handle other things? Yes, for anybody who watches this and they're like, well, he's not being real Christian when he's like taking a sword to somebody. You got to put it in the perspective of he literally needs to survive to get to his destination. And the people that are around him are evil. They are intentionally betraying what God wants for them and their purpose, and they're trying to hurt and harm him and people that are innocent. And so he, like Sergeant York, deems this as an extenuating circumstance. He tries to avoid it. He tells people to, he warns them. He tells them to stop. He gives them a chance to back off before he has to enact anything. And so I don't think the violence deters from the image of what it's like to be a Christian. You just kind of put it in a box and realize it's more focused on how does, like the director said, how does the person who is dealing with the word let the word affect them, and how does that person plan on using the word?
Mm-hmm. The writer said whose hands it is.
Right. Because Carnegie, much like the Catholic Church of, the 1400s and many other, cults and Christian denominations, they take the word and then they pull what they want out of it to manipulate people, to control people, to put an influence or power, or to gain some kind of notoriety, or to make themselves look good. This is kind of putting Carnegie in that spot of somebody who is in a position who would take the word and use it for their own gain, and doesn't care about the whole God part of it or honoring God. He cares about the fact that if I am convincing enough, I can take what's in here and convince people to do what I say because God says so. And so Eli wants to pass the word on, because he says the world needs the word. The world needs it. And even Carnegie says the world needs this book. And Eli says, I have to agree with you on that. I 100% agree. The world needs the Bible, but not the way that you want it.
I was also thinking about the end of the movie where he, I guess, is dying. I didn't realize he was dying from his wounds until he actually died at the end of the film. But I think it's heavily implied that he is sustained supernaturally by God to give the word. Like God keeps him alive in order to recite the entire word, but also, like, I think supernaturally through him is able to recite it correctly.
I think it's a little hammy, but he ends up, after his journey is complete, what does he end up? In white robes. Mm-hmm. As he's reciting the word and recalling his journey.
They wash him too. They give him like a bath, like baptism, maybe.
So there are some weird things for somebody who's not a Christian. They get a lot of things right with this film in regards to that. Didn't want to interrupt you, but I did think about one of the other cool things I liked was the position of Solara, because she grew up after the world ended, and she's in a post-apocalyptic world, and all she knows is chaos, and all she knows is manipulation and dictatorship. And she gets introduced to the word, and the portrayal of a person hungry after the word, not knowing 100% what they're getting into, but asking questions, inquiring, and just letting somebody pour into them and talk to them about the word in a positive way. I don't know if there's any specific parallels, as much as it's a beautiful thing, that I don't know if they knew that they were doing that, but like Pilgrim's Progress-ish mixed with just a new believer of trying to understand life, walking out life through the word.
I truly believe, and this is one of the reasons I started my ministry, that God uses many different avenues to point back to himself in everyday life. I'm not saying like that you should ever substitute like a movie or something for the actual literal word of God, like the Bible. But I think that even when men think they're doing everything on their own and by their own free will, God still puts his hand in some things, and he still uses things to capture and reflect his beauty, even when everyone else doesn't realize that's what's happening. We talk about that all the time. It's one of the reasons why we even started the ministry, is that there is a beauty in the creation of cinema that directly is connected to the beauty of God. And I like, with a film like this, it feels like God intervened in some ways to make sure certain things were correct, and not in a huge way. It's kind of like in the story itself, like God's hand in the story is powerful, but it is literally invisible in a way that is like, it feels like the biblical God in that way, where it is powerful, but it's not shooting people with, like, you know, smiting them and
there's, I mean, at the end there's biblical comeuppance, because Carnegie gets the Bible, he opens it up, oh, it's in Braille and I can't read it, but the wife, his Jessica Biel's Claudia is blind. She knows how to read Braille, and as he is like desperate, she abandons him. She's like, then you'll never know. You know, I'm not giving you that gift of knowing what the word says. And so she leaves him to rot while his literal city is burning down around him. Because
during this whole final thing, this final attempt, this desperate attempt to get this thing, to get the book, he lost everyone. And it's like God knew that would happen. He made sure it would happen. And like, it's a fictional universe, we know that. But if you actually do read the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament, that happens so many times where we see where God allows certain things to happen. And we're like, oh, because this happened, now this person's free to do the will of God. And it's like God hedges you in, right? He protects you. He guides you in ways God's playing, 4D chess at all times. Like, we could never, ever keep up with him. But that's also why he's trustworthy, because of his sovereignty. Once again, that was a huge theme. I didn't even pick up on it until I said it. I was like, yeah, his sovereignty is a huge theme in this movie, which is really cool to see that come from people who claim to be atheists and non-believers, and yet miraculously, they make a movie like this. I'm just saying, it's kind of cool. I'll ask like not fun, but one more question and then we'll wrap it up. The writer said he intended it to be like a Western, which was interesting when I read that, because I was like, yeah, I could definitely see the Western influences, but he wanted it to be like a classical Western kind of action, but set in a post-apocalyptic world. So you have like the Western hero, the action of like traditional action films of like the fighting and everything, and then like the setting of the post-apocalyptic desert. Did you see any of those influences in the film where you were like, oh, they're referencing this, or this is very Western-y or whatnot?
I mean, part of it is the classic bad guy loses, good guy wins at the end. There isn't any ambiguity. You know, the bad guy and his team lose because of their own failures, and the good guy triumphs. Even if that means he ends up losing in the end, losing his life, his legacy continues. And so that's a very classic, nice bow tie at the end wrap up. I think I mean, if you were to just like switch out a few things, like instead of cars, they are on horseback, and there's farms, and there's a few things. If you switch it out, it's clearly like that. I mean, it's a very deserty environment. Color palette is gray with a side of dark
brown.
Gray,
Side of brown.
Yeah, and so it feels like, and sometimes it's almost in black and white, which is interesting because at the end of the film, when they get to the coast, it kind of becomes colorful. If I'm wrong,
I remember that. Yeah, for sure.
It adds color at the end when they reach the coast, and there's grass and there's water, and it's a very interesting change at the end. But it is very much feels like an old Western where the bad guy posse is chasing after the good guys, and they end up being defeated because of their own sin.
I would say there are elements to the film that are very actually obviously Western. When I read that, I was like, oh yeah, like he comes into that town, he goes to the bar, he asks for a drink. He's an outsider, that it comes from a lawless wasteland. Well, I don't know what the West was considered necessarily a wasteland, but definitely lawless, where you have bandits, you have people out there who are not very nice that will rob you on the road. And then he comes to a town that has a semblance of law and order, which is what the Wild West, goes to the local saloon, all these things. He's considered this outsider. There's a gang there. It has a lot of the elements of classic Western that I was like, oh, why didn't I even see that until I read that? I appreciated that. I love it when cinema that's such a film student. I love it when cinema is self-referential, but it's nice. It's nice to see those different styles be used to make new stories, and something that's classical, trope, and archetype be given a new face, a fresh twist. I enjoyed that part of the film, and I agree with the color palette. It does get more colorful and bright at the end of the film, which was obviously, so this is 2010. This is a couple years after digital color grading became really big. The film Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? That was kind of the first time it was used to tell, well, it was really the first time it was used like in film that I remember reading about. But the Coen brothers that made that movie, they used it as a way to tell the story. So if you watch it, sometimes it's almost black and white because it takes place in the 20s. Whenever certain things happen in the story, it'll get like very brightly saturated with color. And they like the idea of being able to manipulate the color in their film to tell their story. And I'm glad that this film also did that, because it was another tool that is now it's basic part of filmmaking, but back then it was like a new thing of like, how can we manipulate the color digitally? And we're using digital cameras, we can get different exposures and whatnot. So that is a really cool thing that you noticed, that they were going so highly stylistic, but I don't think it detracts at all from the film. I think it adds to it. Okay, well, I think that's another movie under our belt, The Book of Eli. We really enjoyed it. We recommend you watch it, but please know that there is some violence. The cat dies. There's this video. There's this website called Does the Dog Die? Which is, they need to expand their database, but basically it's, if you are about to watch a movie, you can like go on there and just see like all of the things that happen in the movie that you might not like. One of them is, does the dog die? In the very beginning, Eli kills a cat to eat it and he makes oil out of its body. I'm so sorry to say that. I know that was disturbing, but it was disturbing for me. It's like the first thing that happens in the movie, and I was like, Will hadn't seen it forever, so he was like, oh no. But yeah, cat dies. And then other people obviously meet their end, but it's all it's action movie level violence. I can't really remember there being like a lot of bloody, gory stuff.
There's a bridge scene, but they cover it up. The bridge, they fight under a bridge, and it's all shadowed, so you see silhouettes. The other scene that's pretty bloody is the bar scene where he clears the bar. That's a bit bloody as well.
And then some strong language. And then there are some suggested sexual things. they're highly suggested. I don't, like I said, no nudity. I don't remember any of that, but
There's one scene where a couple bandits get Solara, and it's implied that if Eli didn't get there in time,
something would have happened.
yeah, so they start tearing at her clothes. Nothing is revealed. She, when they pants back to her, she's fully clothed, but it's letting you know that how bad these bandits were, and Eli comes to save her.
So, like I said, trigger warning. I can't remember the rating of the film. I can maybe look that up real quick. Okay, it is rated R for brutal violence and language. So it's technically rated R. So just, take that in consideration if you watch it. But we really enjoyed it. Like we said, it has a lot of great values and aspects of the film that are encouraging for Christians. One of them is the deep respect it puts on God's word, God's sovereignty over those who believe in him.
As I always said when I talk to people about this, if it wasn't for the language and the violence, this would be in your local Christian bookstore.
There have been I've met some fundamental Christians who have watched this movie. Also, it tends to be a dad favorite movie. My dad really likes it. I think your dad really likes it. It's just one of those movies dads seem to gravitate towards. You ready to sign off?
Adios.
Well, I guess we'll see you on the next one. Bye.